Hi, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Remote Career Success Week. I'm Lauren from arc.dev, a platform that makes your jump to remote easier by simplifying your job search. And we connect software developers everywhere with great remote opportunities. And today I'm really excited to be here with Steph Smith, who is head of trends and product manager at The Hustle. To get started, as you've heard from our other talks, we are, instead of introducing our speaker extensively, from my perspective, we're going to kick it off with that, that interview question. Can you tell me about yourself? The weirdly terrifying question where you wonder even who you are at that point. So why don't you kick us off with that, Steph? Give us your little 30-second elevator pitch.
Yeah, it's so much pressure. I'm used to being introduced, so I'll try my best. I'm Steph. I do a bunch of things. I am a creator and indie maker. I'm also a writer, and I worked in a bunch of different industries. Right now, I'm a product manager, but I've also been a consultant, been a growth marketer. So I love tinkering with different things, both inside and outside of work. I taught myself to code in 2018, so I created a bunch of projects for fun, and recently wrote a book about, it's called Doing Content Right. So a little bit of a silly title, but yeah, I just love building things. And right now, as you mentioned, I am a product manager at The Hustle, leading their premium subscription, which is Trends.
Awesome. I'm really excited to hear more from you. I know yesterday, actually, our last speaker of yesterday was mentioning one of your blog posts, writing is thinking.
Oh, nice.
So I'm sure everyone here is excited to hear more from you. And I personally really want to hear more about your blogging tips for my own personal interest too. So, let's just start off by, I want to ask you how you decided to pursue both a career in product management, and also when did you decide you wanted to work remotely?
Yeah, so I'll start actually with working remotely because that happened first. That happened in 2016 for me, or it started in 2015 and took 10 months for me to find a job that I was really excited about to go remote for. But I had graduated with a degree in chemical engineering. Then I went into management consulting, and I liked a lot of management consulting, but I knew almost immediately that's not what I wanted to do. The 2-hour commute, pretty classic story of like, there must be a better way. And there was when I found out you could work remotely. And so that was like a priority for me. I ended up spending 10 months, again, trying to find a role where I wasn't kind of trading away my career for the ability to work flexibly. I knew, which I think a lot of people know now, but at the time wasn't clear that didn't have to be a trade-off. So that's when I started working remotely. Since then, I worked in a bunch of different, like I started as a growth marketer when I started working remotely. Then I led a publications team. Then I became an individual contributor on Trends, and now I lead the product as a product manager. So to answer your question about being a product manager, like it was totally not, I guess, forecasted, and I had no idea. There wasn't really a trajectory where I was like, I definitely want to be a product manager. But I ended up here just through what I call, or the way I describe it is, if you've ever heard of Bezos talk about like regret minimization, for me, it was always just like, what am I not going to regret doing? Which is why, if I had just followed the trajectory that I started with in management consulting, I would have been in a much different place. But it was consistently like, what interests me most? Like, of the job opportunities that I could pursue right now, like, what am I excited about? What do I want to be spending like half or a third of my life doing? Because that's how much time you spend at work. So I know it's not maybe the perfect answer, but really it was a series of events that led me to product management, and maybe not such a traditional path there that some other people might have.
Yeah, it sounds like your path is unique, but you ended up doing something that you love, which is amazing. And I love how you mentioned that you didn't want to sacrifice, your career path for remote. I feel like if anyone, aside from all the amazing tips you learned today in our audience, if you want to take anything away from this event as a whole, it's just that you actually really can have an amazing, fulfilling, just overall awesome career and work remotely at the same time. You don't have to sacrifice your career for working from home. So your current job at The Hustle, can you tell us more about how you got that job with Trends, and what the application process was like where you found it, how you applied, and how you landed it?
Yeah, so again, I have gotten multiple jobs through a traditional process where you apply and you go through a bunch of interviews, and you are seeking the job. In this particular case, I actually heard from Sam, and it was interesting because I had actually heard from him in early 2019, and we talked about a different role, a more growth-oriented role first, and that one had to be in the office, at least at that time. And so we went back and forth, and we just decided it wasn't, I wasn't willing to kind of give up that part of my life. And so we kept in touch, but Sam reached out again. And it's funny because he reached out once I had published now still my most popular article, which is this article called How to Be Great. And that had gone semi-viral, and he had reached out again and basically just was like, I want you on my team. Like, what can we get you working on? And Trends was starting to, or just had launched at that point. And so he's like, would you want to work on Trends? And I was like, absolutely, this sounds so interesting. And so for that case, the application process was very different to a typical one, but I think it really helped that Sam had consistently seen my work online. So it was almost like I had gone through a 6-month job interview by just him following the things that I was producing, versus a traditional job interview where obviously you're trying to prove to this person in like a 30-minute window what you can do.
So that wasn't alongside him seeing your online presence, I guess. Had you also met him like face to face? How did you?
So never met him. The first, I had followed The Hustle for a while. TopTal used to advertise with them, and I just loved the newsletter. So I had been reading them for years. But no, we hadn't met each other. I kind of knew of him through knowing of The Hustle. But when he reached out originally in like February or something, like we had never met, we had never talked. At that time, we actually had more of like a formal like 30-minute interview. But then we decided, we're not going to move forward at this time. But then again, 6 months later, I guess we had been interacting a little bit online, and then ended up in me switching jobs.
Wow, that's amazing that just the way you exist online can have such a huge impact and like lead people straight to you.
Yeah.
When you were speaking, there was like a weird background noise, like a clicking sound. I don't know if you know what it is.
No, is it still happening, or is it?
It's a little bit. It's not terrible, but.
Okay, I don't know. It might be my headphones, but
maybe you're like brushing the headphones or something. I don't know. It's okay if I figure it out, but just to make it the sound a little clearer. But don't worry about it. We all know technology can be the way it is.
Yeah, even after working remotely for 5 years, still.
Yeah. It's for everyone who's been thrust into the remote work world at places that weren't prepared for it. I'm sure you know how things can be. So do you remember, I guess, when you got this job, did you actually have a formal interview? And if you did, what kind of questions did they ask you, and how did you answer them?
Yeah, so I think with most remote job interviews that I've done, including The Hustle, there is obviously an interview portion of it. They ask you about your background. They ask you, about, specifics related to the role that you'd be doing. But one thing that I've seen, and I really like across most remote job interviews, is that they just throw you into the job, right? There's always some sort of assessment. Back when I was interviewing for other roles in the past that were non-remote, you'd go in, you'd do maybe 3-4 interviews, and then they'd be like, you're hired. But often there wasn't, an assessment part of it. And so for this, both with Trends and again, previous remote jobs that I had applied for Trends, they're like, look, you'd be writing about X, or here's actually something that someone on our team has written, like, can you take it to the next level? Show us. And that's what I had to do. So yes, I had to, talk to Sam, and I don't think there was anything specifically like unique about the interview questions, but I wanted to call out that in general, with pretty much every remote position I've applied to, the best part is actually your ability to just show them what you can do instead of just trying to, vaguely talk about your skills in an interview question.
Yeah. So do you remember I guess they could see so much just from what you've done online that you have already really showed them, but do you remember any stories you told during the interview process to kind of prove yourself as the person they wanted to work there?
Yeah, I think more and more I've leaned, whenever I do interviews, or recently I've done interviews, I lean less on like, oh, I was at this particular company and this was my role or this is my title, and more so the question, and this is also what I vet for, because I interview a lot of people now, is, within an interview, everyone's going to tell you they're amazing. That's their job in an interview, to say, hey, I'm great at X and I accomplished X at whatever company. But you don't know what circumstances. Maybe they had a huge budget. Maybe they actually had other people working for them to get to those goals. The thing that I like to try to vet and also try to convey when I'm on the other side is like, what do you do when no one's watching? right? Because again, it's your job in an interview to sound good. But what do you do when you're, like no one's interviewing you, and like every week, are you working on your own projects, or even not your own, like, paid projects or things online, but like, do you have hobbies? What books do you read? What do you find interesting? Like, what people do you follow? Who inspires you? And those are the kind of questions that, again, you're vetting basically, like, what are the things that when no one's looking, no one's asking you to do anything, what is your natural state? And that's especially important for remote work when people are, people say that you're like a manager of one, right? You need to be more self-directed. And so if you're working remotely, especially, like, how do I know that when no one's watching, when I'm not watching what you're doing, which is important because I want to give when I work with autonomy, that you're going to have the right kind of inclinations. And so that's the type of stuff that, even at the beginning, I mentioned, like, I taught myself to code, or like, I love creating stuff online. I wrote a book. These are all for fun, right? Like, no one's asking me at work to do those things. And so when I'm in an interview, I try to lean on those things pretty heavily to show, or try to indicate that I'm ambitious and I love creating things and I'm creative. And again, things that I could say, but have less weight just by me saying them, because everyone says that they're creative and smart and capable.
Yeah, I think that came up a lot in our interview with Tim, the director of engineering at GitLab yesterday too. He was saying basically the same thing. Just do your side projects. It can prove that you can work well remotely, and also just make you stand out. People remember you, like, if they remember your cool projects that you shared, your side hobbies, if they're interesting. So I hope everyone in our audience now is already thinking about, like, what fun side projects you can do to show to help improve your career prospects, and just for fun. I mean, you should do it what you love. Do what you love. Don't do it just because you feel like you have to, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
So I feel like we already know that. I think what really made you stand out that we all want to know more about is your blogging and your online presence. So I'm curious, like, I want to hear more about your story of how you got to where you are now, because it's like such a great leap. Like, if I'm starting off running a blog, I'm just going to be a nobody with a blog that no one looks at probably to start. Like, how did you get from that beginning point of, like, hardly any Twitter followers and that your blog not showing up in #1 of Steph Smith Google results? And how did you get to where you are now? Do you remember when you started?
Yeah, so I started at a company called TopTal, which was fully remote. That was like the beginning of my remote career. And then while I was there, I learned about everything kind of growth marketing related. It was still to this day probably the most fun part of my career, because it was just, I had learned so much. And then after like a year and a half of that, I got promoted to lead the publications team, which is actually, it's funny because I never in like my life, like, I did a degree in chemical engineering, which is so like hard sciences, thought I would end up like leading a publications team. Not that it's any better or worse. It's just in high school, I hated writing. So the thought of leading a publications team would have been so outlandish at the time. But I realized that a lot of even, the written aspects of marketing are not so different to science, in that they follow, like, you hear a lot of the same terminology, like experiments or testing or confidence levels, and all these things within marketing I started to really get interested in. That led me to publications, and I got to lead this super cool team at TopTal. And that's where I started to learn about content more. I had learned a little bit on the growth team, but that's where I was like, wow, like, I need to now lead 3 blogs and grow to 6 and all this stuff. And that's where I started to learn about, like, what are people interested? Why do people read some content online versus other content online? And then I started to appreciate what's really important, which is some people view a blog as like this vague, this vague entity online. It's a communication tool for you to reach other people, potentially infinite people, because we have technology now. But it's this idea that, just like a book, your job when you write online is to communicate some line of thought to someone else. That's all you're trying to do. And as I started to get more into, that publications team, I realized there was a bunch of things that I wanted to communicate, right? Like, my first post at the time, or one of the first posts that took off, was this guide to remote work that isn't trying to sell you anything. Because I had just been around so many other people who were writing things about remote work and trying to sell courses on how to be a digital nomad and all this stuff. And I just was like, you know what? I have something to say here. And that's all it was. So it started as just like a tool for me to communicate certain opinions I had or expertise I had. And then it just grew from there. I guess partially because I had focused on things that I had expertise on, versus I think a lot of people start blogs and they're just like, I want to start a blog because everyone has a blog. And that's okay if you enjoy it. But if you really are trying to reach a lot of people, or make a mark, then your best bet, and we can talk about this a little more later, is to figure out, what your area of expertise is and how you're going to differentiate around the endless content online. But that's kind of a roundabout way of saying, like, I kind of just fell into it in some ways. But then after I kind of realized this like incredible tool that exists, which is like, writing online, I just continued to do it. And then I joined Trends and got other expertise there. But now I think it's one of the most powerful things that I have, I guess, available to me.
Awesome. So what was your very first blog post? I'm really curious to know.
So actually, no, I do remember my very first blog post was this thing. It's kind of a silly name, but it was called like the Year of Sponge. So before I started a blog, the actual lead up to it was learning to code. And I had spent most of 2018 learning to code. And I'd done it in such a way that the way I actually accomplished it, because I had tried to learn to code in the past, like many other people, and failed at it, was I had tracked every day, like, am I learning or am I not? And if I was learning, I would like add a little note about like what I had learned. And it was a way to just like keep myself accountable, because you can see when you're tracking something every day, sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I totally learned or like spent time on this recently. And then you look at your tracking and you're like, oh, I actually haven't touched this in like 19 days. And that would happen often, where I was like, okay, this is, again, keeping me accountable, like to what my goal was, which was in 2018, I'm absolutely going to learn to code. And so after that, the first article was me sharing that, which it was called A Year of Sponge, which was, again, like, it was just still to this day the year that I had learned the most, because that's also when I had taken over or started leading the publications team. That's when I learned to code, all these things. And so that article was about that process. What I had learned is kind of like a year in review type thing, but that was also the foundation of what a lot of other people have started to recognize me for, which is building in the open and like my open page and stuff like that. So anyway, that was the first article. So again, it was just a tool for me to like share a story. That's all it was. But then after that, I started getting into other topics like remote work.
Awesome. So the Year of Sponge, you were the sponge then.
Yes.
Absorbing.
Yeah, it was this idea. Yeah, exactly. The idea of the article, and if you guys want, it's still on my blog, was just that when you're young, there's so many, you're forced into being a sponge, right? You're learning about like a particular topic in school, or you're learning about relationships at certain parts of your life, but like you're forced into learning certain things. And then after a certain age, it's like, no one forces you to learn anything. You literally can just stop, which a lot of people do to some extent. And so it was this like forced year of absorption of like, you know what, I want to continue to be this sponge, because like we're malleable and we should learn stuff continuously. So that was the idea of it.
Yeah, I love the way you tracked that too. I feel like I'm going to adopt that into my own life to make sure I really am making progress in all the things I'm learning at the moment. So back down to the blogging, from starting from scratch. Actually, I was also curious to ask, like, what platform did you use to first start blogging? Did you already have your own website set up, or how did you kick that off?
Yeah, so like I said, luckily it happened after the year that I learned to code. So I self-coded my own website, but the blog itself, I use Ghost. I self-host with a DigitalOcean droplet. And there's also an article on my site if people are interested in doing the same. And I've been on Ghost since, and I think it's just like the perfect platform for blogging.
Awesome. Definitely taking notes on that for myself.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your specific framework for blogging to improve career prospects. So say some people in the audience, maybe a year or two into their career, product career or other, how do you recommend they first get started? Can you walk us through this like step-by-step, like how to decide what to write about, how to set it up, how to stand out?
Yeah, so I mean, to premise what I'm about to say about how you can stand out, the first thing to understand is just this concept of how much information there is online. Like, we all know this, but just to recognize that I think I wrote about this partially in my book, but there was, I think, 300 million domains registered in Q1 of this year, just to give a perspective of just how many people are looking to put something online, right? And not all of those are blogs, but a significant portion of them are. And so once you understand that, then you have to understand that, well, just by nature, like, we simply cannot read everything that's online. And by the nature of tech being infinitely scalable, the best stuff rises to the top, right? So it's not distributed evenly. If you're born in 1950 and you create a newspaper, you're only competing with the people in your city. If you create a blog today, you're competing with everyone in the world, right, on a particular topic, which is great. And daunting at the same time, right? Because if you do create something amazing, you can reach everyone. If you create something mediocre, you will reach no one, right? That's kind of the paradox that we're in with technology. And so if you recognize that, then you must kind of understand that, okay, then I'm competing with everyone. What am I actually going to choose to compete on, right? And that's something you should seriously consider, because a lot of people, again, they decide, I'm going to create a blog, great, but how are you expecting to reach people if your blog is even, pretty good, but not amazing? Unfortunately, there's going to be amazing stuff that supersedes your stuff in terms of grabbing people's attention. So then the question is, okay, what can I create that's amazing? And you have to think about what your differentiator is, right? And, I've used terms, and I didn't invent this term, called like your personal monopoly. Like, what do you know better than like 99% of the population? And you don't need to be the best at it, but just know that the more you've thought about something, the more you've spent time with something compared to the rest of the population, the more likely that your work is going to be useful to that cohort of the population that cares about that thing. And so I encourage people to just start asking questions like that, like literally, like, what do I think about in the shower? What have I spent time on that 95+% of the population hasn't? So it can be simple things like with my, in my case, when I started writing at the beginning, I at that time had been working remotely for 3 years or so, which doesn't sound like long, but most people hadn't been working remotely for 3 years. And they also hadn't been both an IC and a team lead. They hadn't worked at a completely remote company like TopTal. So I did actually have like some unique expertise, not necessarily the most in the world, but enough that it could be valuable if packaged the right way to other people. And so I would encourage people to start thinking about what their differentiator is. And then in addition to that, if you are doing this to get some sort of job or to enhance your job prospects, you obviously want to consider, what what types of information are actually going to help you get there. So for example, for me, I have articles about remote work, coding, just like personal development stuff. The stuff about remote work or coding probably isn't going to get me jobs in marketing. It might get me some attention, but it's not. But the stuff that has gotten me, job prospects, like at The Hustle, were things like my How to Be Great article. So people know that I'm just an ambitious person interested in personal development, probably someone who would try to do a good job at their company. And that's gotten me prospects. But that is a little bit of something that you need to figure out depending on what you're looking for in your career. But naturally they should fit together in some way, right? Because you shouldn't feel forced to write about a particular thing, because if you're not enjoying writing about it, you're probably not going to enjoy actually doing that thing in a job that you would be hired for if people were to see your work. So that's, I guess the key takeaways there are just remember, whatever you create has to be excellent. And the best way to get to excellent is what are you actually excellent at? And that again shouldn't be divergent from what you actually would be seeking in your career, hopefully, because whatever you're going to get hired for is what you're going to be doing for much longer than the time it would take you to write an article.
Yeah, it sounds really intimidating thinking about just the competition out there to rise to the top of the Google search or whatever. I think, but even if it seems like even if you have a great looking website, as long as you potential employers can find it when they're looking at your profile, that's also really helpful, I think.
Yeah, and something to add on there is a lot of people spend so you do need to make your writing good, if not excellent. But if you want to use this actually as some sort of mechanism to drive your job prospects, you need to learn how to distribute your content. Most people, separate from whether they're doing it for their career or otherwise, spend way too much time on writing and then just expect, similar to how people do this with products as well, they just expect if it's good, people will come, and that's not the case. You need to invest in actually getting your information out there, and the best way to do that is learn about how to distribute content. It may feel artificial in some ways because you're oh well, if it's great, people will share it, but most things in life, again, same thing with products. That's why most successful companies have very influential growth teams, is because even if something's great, you need to give it a nudge so that people will actually be able to, or it will be able to surface, and then people can share it.
Yeah, that sounds really, that's a really important part of it. And I'm curious, so if I've written a blog. I haven't actually, not yet, but so I have a marketing blog. I've written 10 amazing posts in my niche of amazing knowledge. What do I do with it? Where would you say I should distribute it?
It depends on where the people you're trying to reach are hanging out, right? So, I mean, there's all the social platforms. The one thing that I think people, if you are interested in building like a long-term publication online for yourself, you need to learn SEO. And you don't need to like learn it and become an expert at it, but you need to understand the fundamentals, because the thing that you should know is, so there's social channels, there's viral channels, there's SEO, there's so many different types of channels. But organic traffic is one of the only ones that is what I call like a bedrock channel, which means that if even if you write an excellent article and it trends on Hacker News, you get 30,000 page views that day, and then it disappears, right? You get some residual effects of it, but overall it disappears. If you learn how to do search engine optimization well, every article that you get brings in some foundation of your bedrock that builds up on top of each other. That's really key. So if you really want to do more than have these like viral stints, the best thing that you can do if you're running any sort of online publication is learn the basics of SEO.
Like one feature is temporary, but showing up in everyone's Google searches, that lasts much.
Because it's an engine for you, right? Like it's search engine optimization. It's when anyone searches, for example, how to be great, they're getting to my article, and I'm not doing anything today, even though I wrote that article a year and a half ago, right? Versus, it's the difference between active and passive growth, right? Where if you invest today, search engine optimization will bring you like value into perpetuity, or however long you rank. Versus if you do social, you should still invest in social and in some of these viral platforms like Hacker News if it makes sense for your audience. But the key is that that should not be your end all be all, because if it is, then you're just going to get these spikes that help you and get you excited and give you dopamine when they happen, but they're not long term. And then your success is always based on what you're doing today, right? Instead of what you've built up in the past.
Yeah, give it a life of its own and set it free there. So I guess if we're thinking about a checklist, so first, step one, figure out what you're going to write about for our audience who might want to start their own blog. So figure out what that thing that you know well, and then next set up your blog itself, which the platform you recommended was called Ghost. I don't know, I'm not super familiar with.
Ghost.org.
Ghost.org. So is that free? Can anyone just set up a blog for free?
It's not free, but it is. So you can set up, so they have two different parts, which is the actual platform and then the hosting. If you use Ghost Pro, you get both, right? So, but it is pretty expensive. It's, I think, $30 a month, but you can self-host, which means that, again, you pick a server. So for me, I use DigitalOcean because they have a droplet that integrates with it super easily, so it takes like 20 minutes to set up. In that case, the hosting is $5 a month, and then the platform is basically always free, right? But you need to connect it to something so that your site can be hosted somewhere. So for me, I pay $5 a month to DigitalOcean. I get the Ghost platform, and it's up to the person in terms of whether they want to set up their own droplet and stuff like that. But it is not free.
Nice. So step one, your idea. Step two, your platform. Step three, maybe before you start writing, Google what SEO is and learn a little more about it. I know it's a big world, but just to get started, and then start writing with that in mind, and then distribute. And
I would say even, as part of when you're identifying what you want to write about, the one thing that people often get wrong is they focus too much on exactly what they want to write about and not how they want to write about it. So the important takeaway here is, like, if you are writing about, let's say, tech. Well, everyone's writing about tech. And so people aren't going to read your stuff just because you write about tech, right? Most of the time people read things and also share things because something is done in a particular way. So for example, people read The Hustle because of our voice. That sounds, minuscule, but that is literally why they choose to read us versus another publication. Or similarly, when you talk to someone about a product that you love or a newsletter that you love, you're not saying, hey, I love this newsletter because they write about sports. You're saying, oh, this newsletter is so funny, or it's well-researched, or it is more contrarian, or, there's all these different adjectives that you literally use to describe why this thing is better in some way. And so if you are going to write online, again, because we're in this sea of just endless content, I understand not necessarily what you're writing about. That's important, but mostly how you're differentiating. And I'll just quickly tack on the example that normally gets people to like really deeply understand what I'm talking about is Costco, which is obviously not a written product, but it is a company. And in the sea of general retail, the reason Costco has done so well is because they have found one thing that they differentiate on, which is cost. It's literally in their name. And they've traded off everything else, which means they know there's a cohort of customers that cares so much about cost. They don't care if their stores are hard to get to, if they look like warehouses, if the product sizes are like way too big and no one needs like 8 packs of Q-tips. They don't care if they don't get any customer service. All of the things that, if you were to name like 8 or so things that most retailers care about, Costco is like, I don't care about any of this stuff, and I just care about cost, because we know there's some people that above all care about cost. And so it's the same mechanism with content, where you don't need to be perfect, grammatically perfect all the time. You don't need to be, if you're funny, you don't need to necessarily be as deeply researched. But if you're deeply researched, maybe you don't need to be as funny or contrarian. You get the point. You need to find one thing that people care about with the particular niche that you're writing about, and then execute and become the best at doing it in that way.
Yeah, I think just making yourself stand out in that way, your unique voice too. I think it makes a huge difference. Especially, I get a ton of newsletters, email newsletters, and The Hustle is one of them. And it's always the subject lines that are super quirky and fun and eye-catching, and it makes them really stand out from the rest. So I think that's a really great piece of advice. And
exactly. And the final thing I'll add on there, I know I'm rambling about this, is just, if you're unsure if you're doing this right, just ask yourself, like, why would someone share my content or read it? Like, just ask yourself that question. Same thing if you're trying to grow your Twitter. Why would someone follow me versus the, like, I don't know, hundreds of millions of accounts on Twitter, if not billions, I'm not sure. So just ask yourself those questions, and ask yourself, if someone were to share this with a friend, how would they describe it? What is my differentiator? Because if they were going to share it, they would say, oh, I love Steph's newsletter because it's X, right? Or it makes me feel this way, not because it's about X, right? So just ask yourself those questions. And if you don't have the answers, that's okay. That just means you need to kind of like revisit a couple of things and adjust so that you can get to those answers.
How would you answer your own question about that, about your blog?
I don't, so people have asked me that. I think, I haven't written in a while, but I think the 2 things that people have commented on in the past about my blog, if they were to share it, is like super, well, high quality is such a vague word, but like deeply researched isn't really accurate here either, where it's just like anything I write about is like I'll spend months on certain articles, and I will triangulate different sources, and I will try to create something really incredible. But the other part that I think is maybe a little more clear is that everything I write about has no agenda. It's very like honest, which means it's from me, but it also means that like I'm not getting paid by anyone, and it's often like I'm not afraid to share my opinion, versus most of the time you're not going to get that through something like Forbes, because Forbes has an agenda, whether they it's not necessarily a good or bad agenda, but they have a specific purpose as a publication. And so that's why certain articles like mine, like How to Be Great or The Guide to Remote Work, that's not trying to sell you anything, I think those are the reasons that those particular articles took off relative to the other stuff that I've written.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that too. It's you have that, like, it's just pure learning on your blog. Like, we take a lot away from it, and you're not trying to sell us something while you're at it. So yeah, I really like that. So now down to some tips for job seekers who aspire to have a similar career or similar career path to you. So in product management, remote product management, what do you think are the 3 key soft skills to land a job in that field?
It's a good question. And I think I will kind of stick with things that I think are not just for product management, but remote work overall. So it's the first thing is just like, can you be self-directed? And some people, this is actually something that you need to learn. I remember my first, like when I had first started at TopTal, like it took me like 6 months or so to really feel like I was self-directed in some way, where I was like, I wake up and I know what I'm doing, and I know what I'm responsible for, and I know how to structure my day. So can you be self-directed, such that obviously you work with other people, but like so that you know how to prioritize your own life, your own job, your own responsibilities, and continuously add to the company in some way, right? Because with remote work, like, yes, you might have a manager that tells you, your OKRs or something like that, but most often, like, you need to almost like insert yourself in such a way that you are valuable, right? You're proving your worth, and you need to be able to self-direct that in some way. And tied to that, you need to be able to prioritize effectively and see through the noise, because again, when you're working remotely, there's endless things you could be working on. No one's going to be telling you to work on A versus B most of the time. So can you actually see through the noise of everything that you can work on and prioritize effectively? That's, I think, especially relevant to something like product management. The second thing I would say is, again, this is not just for product management, is just learn every core basic digital skill that you can. And so this isn't really a soft skill, but I think it's relevant in the fact that it will allow you to work more effectively across teams and to understand the context of everything happening in an organization. So that understands like learning basic copywriting, basic coding, like just learning basic HTML and CSS. It includes learning basic design principles, UX. All of these things are going to improve your life if you understand them at a basic level, no matter what role you are in at any sort of digital company. And basically every company in the world right now is a digital company. So if you learn those things, you'll be able to work more effectively. And I think one of the things that I see often is, people are like, well, I'm not going to become a developer, so why should I learn to code? I just think it improves your life so much to understand what's happening around you. And if you've ever heard of T-shaped employees, they're basically people who have, really deep expertise in one area, which is important, but then this breadth across the board, which again allows them to understand what's going on around them, work more effectively across teams, and just create synergies that didn't exist before. And the reason I say this is because I've seen this myself through learning to code very concretely. So that's the second thing. And then I think, I have a couple here. I'm trying to think of the best one to say. But I think one of them is, well, I'll say, so communication is key in remote work overall, but I think everyone knows that. But that's actually something, again, like the learning to be self-directed, where it's like, you must learn to be a good remote communicator. That's not something that you're like born into or not. And then I think overall, one of the things that's really helped me in my career is dropping any sort of, or hopefully dropping any sort of ego. And what I mean by that is like, so the things that have brought me the most opportunity is just what I find interesting, right? And not thinking about, for example, when I was at TopTal, I was leading a 20-person team, and I chose to leave that to become an individual contributor at The Hustle on trends. And it was like one of the best decisions I've made. And so dropping any sort of ego of like, oh, I want to be in this role with this title. Remote organizations, especially smaller ones, tend to be super flexible and kind of almost like mushy in a way where it's like people have roles, but they're not super well defined. And if you are ambitious and if you're interested in certain projects, like you can move into new things. That's basically how I ended up leading the publications team at TopTal as well, where I'm interested, I start working on these new projects. All of a sudden there's this new opportunity that arises. And so I think dropping in sort of ego where you're just ambitious and you're malleable and you want to learn and you hear of opportunities and you take them on, regardless of whether, they're leading you into like some very well-defined path or to some very well-defined title. So just drop any sort of ego and just be excited to learn. That is what I did both at TopTal and The Hustle, and both, I think, like that is why I've ended up where I am in these companies, because it was never about like, how do I get to X role? It was just like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Like, put me on it. Or like, hey, I heard you guys are working on this. Like, can I get involved? So those are some of the just general pieces of advice that I think, again, it doesn't need to be specific to product management, but if you work remotely, learning to do those things, like you can do so much in your career, no matter where you start, if you focus on those things.
Yeah, so self-management, increasing your breadth of knowledge, even if you can't code make your own things with your coding, just understand it enough to understand what other people are doing and drop your ego and communicate. Obviously, every single speaker so far has, of course, said communication. That's becoming very obvious here.
Yeah.
New skill. So if you can summarize this in a sentence or two, what would be your number one non-obvious tip for remote job seekers in your field or in general?
So in general, the first thing I would say, which leads to the second, is if you have not been a hiring manager, pretend to be one for a day. Because so I joined TopTal, never having hired someone in my life. And even just thinking back to like how I went through that job process, I'm like, wow, I can't believe they hired me. So I got lucky. But then as I started to become part of the organization, and then I got into hiring manager roles, all of a sudden everything changed, where I understood how hiring processes work, what their motivations are, what hiring managers' motivations are, what they're looking for, anything from like negotiating a salary to, again, like what people are looking for in interview processes, how they create job descriptions, how kind of arbitrary those can be, especially if you're on the end of creating them, and how it's just a task for you that day to get done, and they're very often not even close to perfect. And so do some of those exercises where you literally go and sit down and create a like potential job description and show like, you know, the steps you would go through, what you're Googling, how you're deciding what actually goes in there versus not. And then once you've actually done it yourself, go look at the job description that you're reading and understand like how that probably came to be. This may sound like kind of arduous, but it's really important. It's a complete mind reframe once you understand from the other perspective of how people are hiring. Now, once you've actually done that, the second thing that I really want to call out that maybe is obvious, maybe it's not, is if you're seeking a job, whether it's in product management or otherwise, understand that basically what some people do or tend to do is they just go and mass apply to a bunch of jobs. You choosing a job and where you want to be is just as important as them choosing you. And I know some people are like, they need to get a job soon and all this stuff, but if you have the time to be intentional about your job, this is the best and biggest decision that you can make. You know, you make many of them in your career, but focusing on making those, you know, intentionally is so important. And as part of that, you know, there's a saying that's like, if everything's a priority, then nothing is. So if you're mass applying, nothing's your priority. And trust me, job seeker or job, vetters can tell. And it's also just doing you a disservice because you're going to end up at some company that probably is investing as little in you as you're investing in them. So instead, spend time thinking about like, where do I want to be? What companies do I respect? What products do I use? What gets me excited? Focus on those companies. Go, you know, DM the founders, find out more about the companies and the people who are working there, and apply there. And again, some people are on a timeline where this doesn't allow, but if you are, this is like, again, the most influential decision that you have control over in most cases of your life, because you're going to be spending half to a third of your life at this job during the time period you're there, of course. And so anyway, the two things that I would say is spend the time to pretend to be a hiring manager, understand the nuances of that, what they're looking for, and how much is a little bit them just figuring things out on the fly, just like you, and then figure out where you want to work, invest in getting hired there. And also when you're in the interview process, be clear on why you want to work there. I can't tell you how many people I interview with where you can just tell that they're just repeating what they're saying at every company and they have no interest in working at the Hustle or TopTal or whatever. And then you can tell the difference between people who truly are like, I really want to work at your company and I've been following it for years, or I love what you're creating. So anyway, those are some of the things that I would encourage people to learn and get involved with.
These are great tips. I'm really curious to hear your advice on like DMing a founder or a CEO of a company. What would you say? Hi, I'm Lauren. I need a remote job right now because I want to hang out with my cats all day. Like, what would you say? Would you ask a question about the company, or how would you approach just getting in there in a normal and not annoying way?
Well, so I would say that if it's a very small company, there's nothing wrong with DMing the founder. But most of the time, if it's like anything above like 30 employees, the founder probably has so many people reaching out to them. So it may not even be best to reach out to the founder. It may be best, like if you want a marketing role, like reach out to their head of marketing or reach out to even someone on the marketing team. They're more likely to respond. And then obviously do your research on them. So if they are, if they're a product that you love, tell them you love the product, tell them why you use the product, and then ask them questions like, hey, is this in your roadmap? Is this, have you ever considered this? A lot of the time you can get pretty interesting opportunities through showing what you can do for this company. So I know there's many stories of like, for example, Product Hunt, their social media manager for a while, like he was just so involved with them on social. They were like, okay, we got to get you like as part of our team, right? Yeah. Or I've had people reach out to us at the Hustle for Trends. They literally have sent us like a potential roadmap. They're like, hey, like, have you considered these features? Like, I think this would really help. And so you don't need to go to that extent, but being like, have you considered this? Or I really think this would be interesting. Or, I see you're not investing in YouTube. Like, could I create some videos for you? Things like that, where I know there's some people who say like you shouldn't be doing free work, but if you enjoy it and you really care about working for this company, like there are things that you can do to get that person's attention. One guy, we didn't end up hiring him, made this website on Card. So it wasn't super hard because it was on Card, but he created a website and it was actually pretty cool. He's like, hey, I'm whatever, like, Steph, if you're seeing this, these are the things I want you to know. And also check this out. Like, it was just that extra little bit of effort where it's like, I'm obviously going to respond to this guy. And so those are the things that I would recommend if you're trying to reach out to people. Just, I mean, again, ask yourself a question like, what would get me to respond as a human? And focus on that versus don't do some vague, like, hey, like, I followed your work for a while. Like, could we hop on a quick call? Like, that is never, that is never going to work.
Like, provide your value to them, like offer something to them. It sounds like they'll actually pay attention to you then, instead of just being one of the many people who's like, I need remote job right now.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, by the way, is like a lot of people, so it's a little different after COVID. So I'm interested to see how this pans out. But like before COVID, there was like two groups of people. One group of people that wanted to go remote because they actually, wanted to lead a better life, as in like potentially even do more work, but just in their own way and be more autonomous. And the autonomy actually enabled them to likely do more. That was how I felt. If I went remote, I would have control over my schedule and my ability to actually contribute more. Now, there's the other group of people who just want to go remote because they think they can like chill on a beach in Thailand, and they're actually like they're withdrawing from their interest in contributing. And so that's really important to tease out in an interview process. And if you are, I guess, in either of those buckets, don't make it sound like you're in the second bucket, because that is like a huge turnoff for a hiring manager if they're like, oh, you just want to be remote just because basically you want to do less work. Like, well, we obviously want people who are interested in contributing and not that. So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, I think just explaining how remote work betters you as a person and an employee, like improves your productivity, allows you to have a better, happier, productive lifestyle, rather than I just really want to be a digital nomad and travel everywhere. I mean, that's totally fine too. But
yeah, I mean, I nomaded for years, but again, it's about what is the incentive for this person to want to hire you, and understanding that. And kind of, you should be honest and you don't need to gear your answers around that, but just before an interview, understanding what someone's incentives are on their end, what they're dealing with, the fact that even little things like before I started hiring people myself, I didn't even realize that like most of the time someone you're speaking to has just been on like 3 calls in a row, not necessarily interviews, and you're just sandwiched in between, and often they're not prepared. And so the more that you can kind of guide them or help them have a great interview on their end, the more likely they're going to be to like want to pass you along, because you're enjoyable to be around, you're enjoyable to work with. So that's why I would really encourage people, if you haven't been a hiring manager, just pretend to be one for a couple hours and understand what that's like.
Yeah, that's really great advice. I think we are going a little over time here, but I do want to ask you one last question before we jump into Q&A. I'm curious what you think about the role that your network can play in your job search, and also how can you approach making new connections remotely? I know, especially during the pandemic, it feels very difficult to meet new people.
Yeah, so the best way that I have done it is just through communities, right? But just not like vaguely joining communities, but for example, like, are you creating things online? Go join a community of indie makers. Are you like specifically interested in no code? Go join MakerPad or whatever. Like, there's endless communities, especially post-COVID, because any community that you can think of for any industry or topic exists. But make sure you're not just like vaguely joining communities to quote unquote network. Focus on first what you're interested in. Find those hobbies, those interests, those whatever you want to do, and then okay, where can I find similar people like that and invest there? And then obviously, like, whenever COVID is over, I found just like going to co-working spaces and stuff like that was an amazing place to network and meet people. But really focus on, like, even the term networking has such a negative connotation these days, because it's like when people think of networking, it's like my goal is to find someone that can help me get to some sort of like something that I'm looking to achieve. And really networking should just be like, what organically am I interested in? Who else is interested in this? And by nature of us hanging out and working on things together, we will be able to support each other. But it's not like this, who can help me get to X? If you're approaching networking in that way, then people will be able to see through that, and you'll just honestly be a worse networker because it'll be clear that you're just focused on the next goal versus actually just investing in yourself and how you can learn new things or create new things.
Now, these are great tips for everyone who wants to try out the networking feature here. It's like a 5-minute speed networking thing, so you can have your chance to make those connections. And definitely, when you do so, keep Steph's tips in mind because they'll be very helpful. Just make professional friends. You know, you don't need to be there looking for something. That comes naturally, I think, when you grow your network over time. So let's scroll through the chat here and see what questions we have. I think I see someone says that the microphone issue was your hair somehow.
Yeah, I saw that in one of the chats and I tried to push my hair back.
It did get better. So I think they're right. That's funny. You never know. Technical difficulties caused by hair of all things. So let's see. So Amanda says, as someone who also hates writing and also a beginning coder, how do you get past the feeling of what do I actually have to offer compared to so many others that seemingly know so much more than I do?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if she's referring to like the writing or the coding or both. I think with writing overall, I've heard this from many people who, especially if they're like non-native speakers, where they're like, I don't feel like a great writer. Just remember, writing is a tool. And most of the time, I've seen so many like popular writers who actually aren't, from like a grammatical perspective, great writers, but because they're storytellers, they're trying to, again, like use the tool of writing to communicate some sort of perspective, people adhere to that. And so just remember with writing, you're taught in high school, like one of the reasons I genuinely disliked English class is because you're taught to write in a very particular way, which is graded in a very particular way, and normally about topics that you don't care about. And trust me, everyone is a much better writer when it comes to topics that they care about. And so that's the first thing. If you feel like you're not a good writer, I also have an article called Writing is Thinking. If you feel like you're not able to write about something effectively, most of the time it's because you don't understand it very well. And so spend the time thinking about the subject and what you're actually trying to articulate before writing it. Now, if it's about, if you're trying to write about coding and you're a beginner coder, you can still write about things that you learn that some other beginner coder will find effective, because you're doing it in such a way where actually if you are a beginner, you probably understand the needs of that beginner coder more effectively than someone who's much more advanced. And so even though I still would say I'm probably like a beginner to medium level developer, more so on the beginner side of things, I was able to write certain articles on my blog about coding that resonated with people who were also beginners. So for example, I wrote the 7 myths of learning to code, because I understood that a senior level developer could never really write that because they couldn't understand the perspective of the beginner and what these myths are, how they're portrayed to that beginner. And so focus on what you know and in the headspace that you are in, and then do the exercise of thinking, are there other people that can benefit from this? And I imagine it as like a scale. So remember how I said, find the thing that you're better at than 95% of the population. Well, you can also reframe that to be, what have I spent more time on, or what do I understand in some way better? And so if you imagine a scale, the absolute one end is like, who is the very best at this? And then the other end is like, who has no experience with this. And you don't need to be at the very edge of where, you're the best. Anywhere you are along this, people further back than you can benefit from what you've learned, right? So even if you're in the middle, that half of people can benefit from what you've learned if you package it effectively. So I would say, summary, if you're trying to write, don't try to write perfectly or grammatically perfectly. Focus on telling a story, and remember, writing is a tool. And then if you are talking about coding or any sort of skill, focus on what you know and what you understand in some, unique way relative to the rest of the population.
That's great advice. I mean, even wherever you are, there's always someone who knows less than you and wants to know what you've learned. So it's great.
Exactly.
I love how things have come along with the internet. There's so much information sharing out there. You can learn anything with a simple Google search now too. So speaking of Google searches, our next question is, what is your number one SEO advice? So, I mean, this is like a rabbit hole, but I would say if you are interested in learning SEO, if you're interested, I'm not trying to sell my book. I wrote a book called Doing Content Right
You can find it at doingcontentright.com. And I talk about SEO a bunch there. There's also a bunch of other courses. If you're looking for a free one, Ahrefs has, I think, 2 courses actually on SEO overall, and they are really great at what they do and like know SEO super well. So I think I would start there and start only with, people who really know what they're doing, because there's a lot of either like on the best end, people who just like overcomplicate SEO, or on the worst end, like are actually like misleading with it. But there's just so much information out there. And one of the core things that if you're going to take anything away about SEO is, you'll read these sites that have like, here are the 98 ranking factors of Google, which are true. Right? Google has like a very, very, very complex algorithm. But what Google's really just trying to ascertain is your site credible? Is the article that you're writing about relevant to the keyword that someone is searching? And is it usable? And so if you go through, you should actually go through an exercise of doing this if you're interested in SEO. If you go through the dozens of ranking factors that these sites talk about, then go through and think about, is this really trying to ascertain if something is credible, relevant, or usable? And most of the time, for example, if something is mobile friendly, that's usability. If it, you're talking about backlinks, that's credibility. If you're talking about like keyword, like finding the right long tail keyword, that has to do with relevancy. So all of these things fit into those 3 things. And so understanding SEO from a fundamental level of like what Google is really trying to accomplish and why it chooses to rank something above something else is the first place you should start. Most people start with, like keyword research and stuff like that. No, start with understanding what Google is trying to do. And then the second area that I would, you can just Google search intent, and you'll find articles on this. Understand what search intent means. There's 4 different types of intent. And this is another place where a lot of people go wrong, because they'll do keyword research for a type of keyword that they're never going to rank on because it has the wrong intent. So that's a couple places that you can get started to learn about SEO, but also welcome to take the free Ahrefs course, but really learn it from the ground up. Don't start with keyword research, because often you'll just be wasting your time.
And so we have a question from Ani that says, do you subscribe to the belief that keyword research /metrics/analysis tools are a necessary investment for successful SEO ranking, or can you still drive organic traffic without using these paid tools in a reasonable amount of time, like relying on other free tools and Google search and keyword planners?
You don't need you don't need the paid tools, but they help. So you can easily do SEO research through, Keyword Planner is actually an excellent tool, and it's free if you have a Google paid ads account. And there's ways around it where you can get it for free, even if you don't pay for ads. So Keyword Planner is an excellent tool. That's one of the best ones, actually, because it's data from Google. So it's the most accurate. However, it doesn't have a lot of the functionality that something like Ahrefs has. By far, Ahrefs is the best tool, but it's also the most expensive tool. So it depends. The way I've had this question asked me a bunch of times, it's like, how much are you investing in SEO? Like, or how much are you writing? If you're writing 1 article a month, like Ahrefs is not worth it. You can use things like Keyword Planner. Also, Keywords Everywhere is an excellent Chrome extension. It's paid, but it's super cheap. And so it's really about, it's kind of like just a cost analysis for you in terms of how much you're investing in SEO, and how core of that how much of that is core to your business. And so it's really just an investment decision for you, but there are tons of free tools. So you don't necessarily need Ahrefs. And even if you get Ahrefs, most people don't know how to use the full suite of the tool. And so that's also something to consider.
So our next question is from Gina, who says, what is your advice for a job seeker who is new to blogging but has ideas in different domain areas, like, for example, data science, politics, some other topic unrelated to the first 2? For example, should you create completely different profiles on different platforms, or is it possible to be effective in posting all blogs to one platform and then tagging each strategically?
Yeah, I would put it all on the same platform, unless they are completely unrelated. For example, if you were writing about like how to buy like makeup, and then another thing would be, I don't know, like security. I think those 2 probably would seem strange on the same blog. But for example, my blog, I write about remote work and coding and a bunch of different things that are have parallels and people who are interested in those things simultaneously, but are different. And so that sounds pretty similar to yours. Data science, a lot of people interested in data science, maybe interested in politics, maybe interested in, I'm not sure what your other interests are. And so one thing to keep in mind here is that it's really hard to grow a blog. It actually is. And so it's much harder, similar to it being harder to grow 3 Twitter accounts, it's much harder to grow 3 blogs. So if they are even remotely associated and you can see some general persona like yourself, the fact that you are interested in these 3 things simultaneously likely means there's other people who are interested in these 3 things simultaneously. Then I would encourage you to just put it all in the same place. And the final thing I would say, especially if you're investing in something like SEO, your stuff can be differentiated because people are finding it based on what they're looking for. So someone can be interested in politics, get to your article, get value from it, and they don't need to read your data science articles. And so overall, I think based on everything that I can understand from you here, I would say to just put it in one place.
Next, we Ani again. When a job app asks, I think when an employer asks what your desired expected salary is, it's a trick question that you should avoid, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, most jobs are trying to ascertain whether you are in their target salary range. To be completely honest, many positions, or sometimes if you get to that point in a process, the company itself doesn't know, hasn't always targeted a range themselves yet. It's really important. It's an uncomfortable question. It's something that I still to this day, even though I've been a part of so many hiring processes, I feel so uncomfortable saying a price range. And often there's just like an information, what's the word? Term where basically like there is discrepancy between like what you know and they know. But I would encourage you to actually, before you get to any sort of interview process, be clear on what you expect, right? So if you are at a target salary range of X, identify that first before you get into any sort of process, because that, if you don't have that identified, that is when you can get to a point in these conversations and they either may tell you a range and it may be too low, or you may say something like, I've literally seen people do this in interviews, or I've had friends talk to me about this where they're like, they asked me this question and I just said a number and I don't actually want that number, I want more, right? And so you define that before. It's not a trick question. Most of the time companies are just trying to ascertain what you're expecting and to ensure that there's alignment there. But the key is to go through the process before you get into any sort of interviews and identify what you're looking for as an employee or potential employee.
That's great advice. Do your research and know what you want first, so you're not caught off guard by that question.
Yeah.
Since either way, it's probably still an awkward feeling question.
Exactly.
So our next question is, when dropping your ego or switching jobs or roles, was there some new role or job that you picked up and dropped shortly after?
So I've done many roles inside of companies that were not official, but at least in terms of official roles, I've kind of gone from one to the other and not really dropped any. So I did a year in consulting, and then I did a year and a half, maybe more, of time on the growth team. And then I started leading the publications team for another year plus. And then I switched to the hustle, which I started on trends as an IC, and then ended up leading it after. So I haven't had any of these like quick job switches that I ended up dropping, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think, like, okay, so the way that we view dating, right, like in our lives, is that you go and you date people, and if it doesn't work after 2 weeks, you break up with them, right? Or you're very focused on like finding, quote unquote, the right person. So you're willing to date people and, have it not work out, and that's okay, right? With jobs, we tend to just like stick around for way too long, right? And it's okay. I know there's like financial implications of having a job and not, but like it's okay if you do a job and it's not right for you to leave, right? Or even to get fired. It's fine as long as you're focused on your goal, which is to find what is going to bring you the most joy and to actually help you grow as an individual, right, as part of that company. And hopefully you help them as well. But the idea that I'm trying to get to here is that it's fine if you go and you drop your ego and you're like, I'm going to go to this job and I'm going to be an IC and I used to lead a team, and then you hate it and then you leave, right? That's the whole idea that I'm trying to get at, is that just as we iterate in our dating lives or in other parts of our lives, you should iterate with your job until you find something that's really, really meaningful to you and that you enjoy, because you're spending so much of your time at work.
Probably even more than your significant other.
Exactly. So why not put the same intentionality behind that?
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. We have a question from Ani again. Are third-party job sites like Indeed the worst place to apply? I mass applied last week as a test run, but only a handful were seen. So like less than 7 out of 90 plus apps submitted.
My opinion is that's not far off being accurate, in the sense that, again, the reason I encourage people to pretend to be hiring managers or to think through what a hiring manager does is them or someone on the recruiting team, if the job is on something like Indeed, they're going to all of these other job sites and they're saying, hey, please put this up. And if they're on something like Indeed, they're going to get a ton of applications. And quite frankly, you're likely just entering a competition that you don't want to be in with something like that. And so instead, I would focus on, again, targeting companies. Like, so it's more work, but you reap the rewards and targeting where you want to work. And often people have actually gotten jobs at these companies even when they don't have an open role necessarily posted, because especially if it's a growing company like The Hustle or TopTal, like they're hiring all the time, and they're in fact behind the ball most of the time in terms of being like, oh, we do need these roles, or like we're really behind on this, but we haven't posted it yet. And so if you can be proactive and think about where you want to work, I would reach out to those people. And another thing that I've seen work for people, I haven't done this myself, is look in your network, find someone who knows someone that works there, and ask them for an introduction. So if you do a cold DM and no one responds, then go, oh, Sally, I know, is my friend, and Sally knows this person really well. So I'm just going to go to Sally and say, hey, I really am interested in working in The Hustle, and I know you know Steph. Could you please, intro me? And if I'm working at The Hustle and a friend intros me, I'm not going to ignore it, right? So you're basically going to go, instead of sitting in this like pile of resumes that's on a server for Indeed, you're going to rise to the top. And so again, if I return back to that question, that quote, which is, if everything's a priority, then nothing is. And so if you're just in this sea of resumes, no one's going to find you, and you'll be very lucky if they find you at the very least. And so instead, be proactive, find out where you want to work, and target those companies instead of just going through the typical route. It's basically like a shortcut, right? And if you're finding a shortcut, that means that most other people likely aren't.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder about the importance of growing your network too. Like if you go in looking for something specific, like wanting people to help you right then, you might actually miss the people who will end up just by coincidence being the one to get you a job in the future. You never know what your connections will lead you to. I've had some really unexpected things pop out of my network that I never was looking for or even expected. So
exactly. And the whole idea here that I think people should take away is that if you're already searching for a job currently, this doesn't help you as much. But if you're not, the best place or the best time to kind of seek out jobs is when you already have one, because you can just do so passively, and that's kind of what blogging does, right? You're putting yourself out there. So instead of it being a push, right, like you're trying to get something, it's really you're pulling people, you're attracting people to you, to your work, to your expertise. And the same thing, like I got the job at The Hustle because of that. Right? I actually didn't have to do any outbound because I had put in the work for several months, if not years, of putting my stuff out there, so that I was pulling people in instead of pushing, trying to get something somewhere. And so if you can, when you are working, start kind of building up your network, start building up your expertise, your creations online, whatever it is, in the meantime, even when you're not looking, so that when you do start looking, it's so much easier for you to actually find something.
Yeah, that's great advice. Always be building your network, I think, regardless of your current situation. I think we have one last question, and we have to wrap up here in a moment. We have a question from Tina, who says, do you ever get help on your writing or someone to help you review your content, especially during your early days, like a friend to edit or anything like that? I'm curious to hear that as well.
I didn't, but I do encourage, if that's something that you're unsure of, it's a great idea. Lots of people find writing buddies or accountability buddies. And it's, again, if it helps you in kind of your writing process, then I think, why not? The whole writing process, and this is also in my article about writing, should be split up, or I think it should be split up, where you're not just like sitting down to write a perfect article. And basically, like, there should be some phase where you're just getting stuff on paper, and then there should be a phase where you're refining it, and then there's a phase where you're like, really polishing it. And if you want to basically kind of offload that polishing step to an accountability buddy or writing buddy, that's great, right? If you can find someone where you can kind of help each other in that way. So overall, I think I didn't use one, but I know lots of people use them and find them super helpful.
I think even if you don't have any friends who are good editors or good at helping you with that, you can always be that person yourself, but just taking a full-on mental break, and you come back with fresh eyes. That I find that really helpful.
Yeah, I literally listened to this last night. Jerry Seinfeld recently did a podcast with Tim Ferriss. And he talks about exactly that, because you think Jerry Seinfeld is like, it's just a legend in what he's done in comedy. And you think, oh, this guy must just be really funny, right? Like, he must just be like born this way. And in fact, you'll find this with most people who have led incredible lives in all industry, that they've just been working really hard for a really long time. And he talks about this exact same. He basically says, you have to have two minds as a writer. And he means this for comedy writing, but in general, it's true for writing overall, where you have to be super easy on yourself, the way you would treat a 3-year-old or someone in grade 3 with their writing in the first step, which means that anything goes, right? Like, put whatever you want on paper. This is wonderful. You're excited. You're just like getting stuff on, so that you're avoiding writer's block and you're just getting stuff on paper. And then you have to switch, and it has to almost be like either the next day or several days later, where you switch, and then you become the most critical person in the world, right? So once stuff is on paper, then you switch and you're like, okay, let me refine this. This is crap. Like, I'm removing this. And you can do that process several times over, but that is kind of this like duopoly where you need to be one thing as you're getting thoughts on paper, but then you have to switch your mindset when you're actually refining it. It's like two different perspectives as you're engaging with writing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're quite over time. We have to head off in a moment to prepare for our next talk, but I see everyone's really interested in the last question. So let's try to make it quick, but let's touch on this topic. We have Tina asking, if you want to work for a US company, but they don't traditionally hire remote, location independent, how would you approach that? And if you're not based in the US?
So most fully remote companies will already have this worked out, but I know that even like, for example, when I started working at The Hustle, I had to kind of like guide them through aspects of this because they hadn't done this before. If you are a US citizen, you can easily be, just start working as like an employee. If you're not, you will be treated like a contractor, but that's fine. Basically, like, even when I worked for TopTal for several years, I would be paid just as frequently as a core employee, but you're paid as a contractor, and therefore you are responsible for doing your own taxes in your own country. So for me, that was Canada, but for you, it might be somewhere in South America. And it basically, from the perspective of the company, they're just paying you like a contractor, so it doesn't impact. It actually makes it simpler in some ways for them, because they're just paying you as a contractor. They don't have to worry about healthcare. And so that's one other thing. You won't get benefits. You can't get benefits just by the nature of the fact that you will be treated as a contractor. That is the simplest way to do it. You can go through the hoops of like getting a visa and all this stuff, but they cannot put you as an employee on their like balance sheet or their like team org structure unless you have a US visa. In which case, that, as most people know, is very hard to get. So to simplify things, you just become a contractor. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice, but that is what I know that I have engaged with, and many other remote companies operate the same way. And the only way that this would be different is if your company happens to have an entity in the country that you are in, which is rare, right? So that's what I know.
All right, so I think we have to say goodbye. Unfortunately, I know we all love Steph, and I could talk to her all day, but we also have other exciting talks coming up, so we'll have to move forward.
Bye, everyone. See ya.